Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Classical Guitar Insight. In today's episode, we'll be taking a look at a very beautiful prelude for lute by the Baroque composer Sylvius Leopold Weiss. You can grab the sheet music for free at the link below, and I hope you enjoy. The prelude we're looking at today is actually only the first movement of a larger work, which is the fifth sonata from the so-called London manuscript. And in this sonata, you'll find the typical movements associated with a Baroque suite. So an allemande, a courante, a sarabande, and a jig, which are all dances. And unfortunately, they're a little trickier to play on the guitar than the prelude is. The main problem being is that the original instrument these pieces were written for, the 13-course Baroque lute, has so many strings dedicated towards playing bass notes as simple open strings. Whereas when we apply it on the guitar, we have to fret many of these notes, causing some contortions and acrobatics in the left hand, which can be very uncomfortable and can cause some musical issues. The prelude, however, adapts quite well to the classical guitar, albeit with a key change, due to its simple bass line and relatively short length. And I would rank this prelude as an intermediate level piece. Taking a look at the music, you probably notice something strange about the score, and that would be the absence of any time signature or measure lines. And that's because this is a very specific type of prelude called an unmeasured prelude, of which Weiss wrote several. The spirit of these pieces is to give the impression of improvisation, which we can see even more clearly if we look at some earlier unmeasured preludes, specifically the preludes written for harpsichord by Louis Couperin. You can see from the score that these were even more abstract in their writing, without even the rhythm being notated, which was supposed to be interpreted by the performer. So in performing works such as these, you want to be free rhythmically in your interpretation, which will contrast beautifully with the metered and rhythmic dances which usually follow these preludes. So now that we have the general character of the music, let's break down the piece into its individual components and put it back together again, which is a very effective method for interpreting more complicated Baroque pieces, for example, a fugue by Bach. Starting with the bass line, we have a very simple stepwise motion in the key of A. And this is the simplest line, and I would suggest in memorizing Baroque music, which can often be quite a challenge due to its complexity, finding the simplest line as a means to be able to predict what's coming up next. On top of these bass notes, we have chords naturally found in the key of A. So, A major, E major, F sharp minor, E7, A. And actually, realizing what Weiss has written is not too large of a leap. It's basically these chords arpeggiated with some passing notes here and there. So. In teaching this piece, I've noticed that students will tend to compartmentalize these chords, and often the last note before a change will suffer a little bit and sound something like this. Where the last note before a change gets cut short. And to counteract this, I would suggest holding that last note before a change, in fact, over the next bass note. So more like this. So although this music is more or less a written down improvisation, you're still going to find a fair amount of structure built into it. And for example, in the first phrase, as this bass line falls down to its lowest point and hits that low F sharp, it also reaches the highest point in the upper voice with the high A. And so there's naturally a beautiful sort of arch to the phrase. And as we hit that simultaneous low and high point, I like to put the most energy into the phrase, get a little bit louder, maybe build up to it, and then as it goes away, as the melody falls down and our bass line comes back to home base of A, to just sort of relax. So we start on A, very relaxed, and as we get away from it and climb up, you get a little bit louder. For me, that's the climax. And we're coming back down. And we're done. In the second section, we're going to transition to the key of E. And let's give it the same treatment we gave the first phrase. So, playing a very simple bass line, something that's very easy to follow. Even from the bass line, you can hear how it resolves to the key of E. Now, let's add the chords on top. F sharp minor, B, which turns into a B7 with this bass note, and that resolves to an E, then an A, and then we have a very long cadential figure on a B7 chord, and of course resolving to the key of E. Much like with the first phrase, in this second section here, we find ourselves climbing up to higher and higher notes, reaching what I consider the climax of the phrase. So, for example, right away we had our old high note of the A, reaching up to a B, and then the highest note of that C sharp. And you can see in the performance I did at the beginning, I definitely gave that note some extra attention, a little vibrato, held it maybe a little bit longer, and it was definitely the loudest note. So again, this phrase has a climbing motion, and then to me, this long cadential figure that follows is letting all that pressure go, and to me, a decrescendo sounds great here. The third section of the piece, where we transition back to the key of A, is the longest and is actually the most difficult. And that's because the chords start moving faster, there's a faster harmonic rhythm, and there's that tricky 16th note passage near the end, which can often go a little too fast for students to kind of process mentally. So I think it's worth talking about a couple strategies that can help someone master a passage like this. So the difficult passage in question is this. And to avoid overcomplicating things, I think it's important to realize what's actually happening in this passage, and that's outlining an E7 chord. And once you know that, you can find some repeating patterns, which again will help you predict what's coming up next and not feel lost in this sea of fingerings. So what's actually happening is this: G sharp, D, B, G sharp, D, B, G sharp. Okay, and what I have my students do is have them say the notes out loud as they play the passage. G sharp, D, B, G sharp, D, B, G sharp, and we run out of room, E. Another way of practicing this passage is to go forwards and backwards through the whole thing, which I know can sound a little bit intimidating, but it's actually a very powerful tool to help master a passage, given it lends itself to this sort of treatment. And what I would suggest doing is starting with a very small group and expanding upon it. So what I mean by that is starting with the first grouping of notes, and then adding the second group, but going back and forth between these two. And only once that's comfortable proceeding to the third, but not simply going groups 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, going 1, 2, 3, 2. And adding from there. So groups 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until you can get all the way through the passage, forwards and backwards. What I'd like to talk about interpretively in the third section is this passage starting here. And what's happening there is the chords are changing faster, the harmonic rhythm is increasing, and to me the piece sort of gains an excitement here, and it helps build up to the climax of the piece very well, which coincidentally aligns with the highest note, this D. So I feel like it's a nice idea to sort of start from a relaxed place, and as the chords go by faster and faster, speed up just a little bit, not too much, and to get a little bit louder. Build to the climax of the piece. The final passage of the piece is an example of pedal point, which is a compositional technique in which you have a sustained note, and in our case it's a bass note, with all sorts of harmonic changes around it. And these changes can be consonant or dissonant from that sustained tone. So what you'll get a lot of the time with a technique such as this are these very interesting dissonant combinations of notes which you may not find otherwise. And in our piece, however, I think that sustained note is meant to reinforce the tonic and then some stability to the end of the piece. Thank you for joining me on this first episode. I hope you really enjoyed it. And next time you can look forward to a little lesson on a caprice by the Italian composer Luigi Legnani.